Welcome to Mysteries of Superstition Mountain. I'm Larry Hedrick, where we bring the past into the present for our future viewers. Today we have another great story by Hank Sheffer.
Thanks a lot, Larry. At one time or another, we've all heard the old story that Jacob Waltz said, "I know of a treasure that'll make 20 men millionaires." Well, I don't know exactly what he meant by that. I know I've never become one of those, try as I might. But what we do know is that as soon as you say the name Superstition Mountain, it conjures up the visions of adventures of searching for gold, searching for Jacob Waltz's Lost Dutchman Mine, or the Jesuit church treasures and the Jesuit gold, or the ever-present Peralta catches of gold from mines from ancient times, from old Mexico. Whatever you might choose, there's something there for everybody to hunt for. Of course, then there are always the people that come from all over the world to go and just see the tranquility and the beauty of the mountain itself. All of the hiking trails and whatnot that will allow anybody to go back in there and see remnants that were left over by the pioneers, and you can pretty much see what the pioneers saw even way back then. Well, however much gold Jacob Waltz may have found here in Arizona remains to be seen. But one thing that we know absolutely for sure is that there was silver, and there was a lot of it. And this silver, discovered in 74, 75, at what has become, I should say, the Silver King Mine, opened up the ball for people coming from all over the world to get a piece of that action. There were cooks, there were anvil pounders, blacksmiths, there were people in mercantiles, there was everybody you could possibly imagine, and in great measure, it opened the area wide open for the cattle business. Now, the fellow that we're going to talk about is J.J. Frazier, or Jack Fraser, and he was one of the best-known cattlemen that came over here. But we really can't say he was the first one to be here. That distinction goes to a fellow by the name of Matt Cavanis, and he and his wife Alice got here sometime before Frazier did, and they established what was known as the Board House Ranch. Confused by many because it was called the Cow Barn. It's pretty much where the Quarter Circle U Ranch is today. But ironically, with Cavanis, that particular board house clue that went along with the Dutchman gold was probably one of the most accurate clues of all of the clues that we see. And it's probably one of the clues that we hear the least about. But that's another whole story. We're not going to go there. That was a long way around Sally's barn to get to our topic for today, and that's J.J. or Jack Fraser. And he was a guy that was born in 1855 over in Nova Scotia. And by the time he was 6 years old, he and his family, I presume he and his family went because I couldn't find anything about the family, only him. But by the time he was 6, they were in Canada proper on the mainland. And by the time he was 10 years old, he had now moved over to Nevada to the Comstock lode where he was working there. And yes, he was 10 years old. And yes, children from 8 to 10 years old worked in some of the old mines until they learned enough and got big enough. Then they could actually walk down into the mines and work as miners. That was a true story. So he was there for about 10 years. And then finally, he managed to go to where the silver was, and that was at the Silver King Mine. He arrived there about 1877, and he was working the mines there. It was interesting. This guy had a propensity for finding ways to make money. I was going to call this the entrepreneur cowboy, but that seemed like way too much word because I couldn't even say it. So it became Jack Fraser, Jack of all trades. And what he found there was, apparently he liked to gamble. And by 1887, the way the story goes was he won a herd of cattle in a poker game. And so he took that herd of cattle, and would you believe he decided to open a cattle ranch? So he established the JF Ranch, the Frazier Ranch, in 1891. And so now Jack Fraser has a real cattle ranch. He's been a miner. He's made money at that. Now he's a cattle rancher. He has that. Things are working pretty well for him until 1892. The first year that he's at his ranch, he hires this young fella to come in and watch the ranch. They built up the buildings. They built a barn. They built the main house, or a windmill for the water. They've done all these things, but Jack has other irons in the fire. Sorry for the pun, but he did. And so he hired this young fella to watch the ranch, and his name was Charlie Noddy, Noddie. Could have been Nudie, could have been Noddy, I'm not sure, but it was Charlie Noddy. And Charlie Noddy was there watching the ranch, and all of a sudden, somebody comes to the ranch and they murder young Charlie. They mess up the house, they ransack everything in the house, they steal one of Jack Fraser's favorite horses, and they just leave Charlie for dead. They don't even know that these guys stole anything, but they tore the place up. Well, now some thought it was the Apache Kid. Well, that wasn't true, because when we do our research, we find out that the Apache Kid wasn't even around at that time. It just turned out to be two nasty people that went down and they shot this kid. They were never found. They took the body of Charlie up to the Silver King, and he is interred up there. His grave site is still there at the cemetery on the Silver King. They never found out who did it, and they never figured out why anybody would want to kill a 13-year-old kid. Well, the Charlie Noddy thing was not so good. It was in the papers, and time went by. And 2 years later, the next thing that happened that was intriguing was that Elijah Rivas died. Now, we talked about Elijah Rivas earlier in one of our video series episodes, and he had the prime land. He had beautiful land up there with deep grass. He had perennial water, and he died. Well, Jack Fraser got right in on that one. It turned out he was the one that handled the probate when Rivas died. And within 6 months, he laid claim to that property, and he added all of Rivas's ranch to the JF Ranch. And so now things are getting bigger and bigger. But now, still he needs somebody to look after that ranch too, so he hired a fella who was from England by the name of Billy Wright. And Billy Wright wound up being his foreman on that part of the ranch, which they now called the Upper Frazier Ranch, for around 20 years. He was up there watching that ranch. Well, in the meantime, we have Jack Fraser, who's forever looking for ways to make money. The ranch was doing okay, it held its own, but it never really turned him into that wealthy guy that he wanted to be. He wanted to be, must have been a millionaire, maybe one of those ones that Jacob Waltz was talking about, I don't know. But at any rate, a couple years after that, we get to 1898. So Jack Fraser meets up with an old friend of his that he'd known back in the Silver King days by the name of William Truman. Now, he knew Truman because Truman had been one of the lead carpenters at the Silver King. And what they're finding out is that they meet up with this fella who needs a grub stake to go to the Klondike, because we now had the 1898 gold rush going on up to the Klondike, and this fella needs a grub stake. So Truman and Frazier, apparently they must have had a lot of faith in this guy because his name was Bill Smith. And they grub-staked this guy, and off he goes to the Klondike. Well, they don't hear anything that we know of from Smith until finally 1901, and they get the word that Mr. William Smith has hit it big. And in that day, just Jack Frazier's part of the pot was $1.2 million. That was then. Y'all can do the math if you want. I already did it. It comes out to about 36 million today. And that's what Jack Fraser now has in his pocket. Well, now it's 1902. And guess what else is going on? And you've seen that in one of our episodes about the Roosevelt Dam. And we're building a Roosevelt Dam that's going to be the greatest thing since shirts with pockets. And so he gets in on this because people were making the travel up and down the Mesa Roosevelt Road, and they need a place to stop. Even the Teamsters needed a place to stop. So they put in a place called Fish Creek Station. Great. That was a place they could change horses, all that wonderful stuff. Well, that wasn't enough for the visitors. So what's Jack do? He builds a lodge. He built a lodge right there that he operated from 1905 until 1909, and it was called the Fish Creek Hotel. It was a big place, and it was very successful. Well, come 1909, he's done okay with this, but he's wanting to move on. So what's he do? He sells everything. He sells all of those holdings. He sells part of the ranch off, and he decides to take and invest all his money into the fertile lands that were down around Florence, not Junction as we know it, but Florence, the other half of the road down to Florence proper. And so now he owns all that property down in there, and he's making a pretty good go with this. Okay, so now we know that he's down in Florence and he's running around down there. It's 1910, and he's moving back and forth into Mesa, into Tempe. He's running back and forth. He's taking care of his business. He still has money being made at the cattle ranch because it's still the JF ranch at this point. And he's starting to dabble in politics. Well, he dabbled all right because he bumps into a guy who's going to be a president. He bumps into Herbert Hoover, who happens to be a mining engineer. And of all things, the two of them wind up together up in the Superstition Mountains, beating and banging on rocks, looking for mineral outcrops, of all things. And they did this for a couple years together. In fact, they probably became pretty hard, fast friends, because now we have Jack Fraser is with the Republican Party representing Arizona for the election of Herbert Hoover. And that was in 1928, 1930, I should say. So now we have Jack Fraser. He's done that. He's messed with the president. He messed around with the other president, Teddy Roosevelt, at the Roosevelt Dam. He's made money there. He's had people at the Klondike. And so now he's running around with these people that he knows. And ironically, even Truman was a member of the Masonic Lodge, the same as Frazier was. And so the big boys were all parts of the Masonic Lodge. And apparently he found a home there because he was in the Masonic Lodge for 68 years. Not bad, because he only lived to be 88, so he was there at the Masonic Lodge for a long time. Now, he dabbled in some other things, too. And one of those things, and I know he had to know Dr. Palmer, had to know him, because Palmer was one of the ones, as we talked about earlier in that episode, who started some drugstores, pharmacies. Well, turns out Jack Fraser's the one who was one of the founders of everybody's favorite pharmacies in Mesa. That was true. He was also the president of the First National Bank, for Pete's sake. So he was dealing with that. We won't even talk about bankers and money. We won't do that. And of course, the Masonic Lodge. Well, he dealt with this for quite some time until we finally get around to 1943. And unfortunately, Jack Fraser's run out of time. He's 88 years old, and he died in 1943. Okay, well, as it stands now, we have Jack Fraser has finally passed on. And he truly was an entrepreneur. He was that he was a pioneer out in the Superstition Mountain. But with his death, you'd have thought maybe that was the end of it. But oh, no, no, no. That's not the way it worked out. Because we get around years later. Bear in mind now, there's still cattle going on. The cattle business is still going on in the Superstition Mountains. It's changed hands. We're not going to go through all that right now. But it's changed hands, but it's still there. And 1978 rolls around. And what happens is that another fella is out. He's been hired to watch the JF property. His name is Manuel Valdez. And out of the clear sky, two guys come out there and they lay in wait for him. They're not quite to the wash. They're behind this little mound of dirt that's off from the front porch. And Manuel walked out on the front porch, and these guys, with their long guns, shot him dead where he stood. Never really knew what the reason was, but it was almost like Charlie Nody's ghost was back, and the murderers that he endured were back again. 86 years later, they did the same thing. They ransacked the house. They stole the horses, and they just made a mess of things. Well, they took Manuel's body and they hauled him down into the wash, which wasn't all that far away, and they covered him up with some sand, and they thought they'd gotten away with it, and off they went. Well, unfortunately, the body was found, and it was found by Manuel's little dog, Priada, who was sniffing around, and an old friend of ours that we've met over the years, Billy Crater. You knew him, Larry. Billy Crater was out there with the sheriff's posse, and little Priada went right to the body, and they found it. They moved what little sand was on top of him, and if it hadn't been for Priada, old Manuel would probably still be out there, or what was left of him would still be there. But anyway, at that point, Billy Crater called the sheriff's department. However, they contacted them. They didn't have cell phones. They got in touch with the sheriff's departments, usually Pinal and Maricopa both, because of where the properties were in the counties. And they found those two guys. They were taken to court, they were found guilty, and they were put in jail. And that was the way that went. So at this point, things quieted down. Jack Fraser's gone. The murderers, they were caught. That was taken care of. And by 2012, the property was now in the hands of George Martin. He and his son were there they took care of the ranch. And that's been ongoing for quite some time until all of that ranch property was bought out by the Quarter Circle U Ranch with old Gus Barkley. So what we know is that while Jack may not have been the first, he was really what we like to refer to as the bell cow. He was the first. He had the big ranch that has come down into what ranches are left out there now. And unfortunately, with the Woodbury fires and whatnot that came through, a lot of the desert was burned up. But from what I understand, all of the JF buildings are still there as they were, if they haven't been graffitied to death or vandalized to death. I really don't know. I haven't been there in years. But we know that Jack Fraser was the guy that got this all started. Why he decided to come into the Superstition Mountains, we know he came for the silver. But other than that, what would have drawn him here to be an entrepreneur per se? I don't think we're ever really going to know what the underlying reasons were for that. It's just going to have to stay one of those mysteries of the Superstition Mountain. Thank you for watching this episode of Mysteries of the Superstition Mountains.